Today, I wanted to talk to you about the OXI One, a very flexible and powerful hardware sequencer, and probably one of my favorite bits of kit in this entire office. It has 4 different tracks and a whole ton of outputs. We've got CV gates for connecting to Eurorack, and we have MIDI in and out. It also features USB MIDI and Bluetooth for connecting to your phone, iPads, things like that. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Stochastic sequencer mode, one of its 2 random sequencer types. And we'll also take a bit of a bonus look at its Euclidean sequencing options. We're of course using the Digitone as a sense today. I've got a few voices already set up. We have a bleed playing. We have an evolving, slightly glitchy pad, and we have a kick and snare, which are from the preset library. The Digitone is being controlled by bitwig via overbridge. I could have plugged the OXI directly into the Digitone over MIDI, but for some reason whenever I do that, the amp envelope of track 1 gets corrupted whenever I use the OXI's transport controls. So I have all the MIDI routing via bitwig instead. So let's stop this jam and get into a fresh set of patterns on the OXI and rebuild this from scratch. Okay, so I'm in a brand new blank pattern for all of my sequencers. And our sequencer track here is already in the stochastic mode, but we could change that by pressing Shift and 1, and we can adjust the mode to anything in this menu. I'm in A minor at 97 BPM, and this is what the initial options look like for the sequencer. We have notes in blue and red along the bottom. The blue ones are in the scale and red is out of scale. And I can adjust the probability that a particular note gets played by just tapping the column, and the higher up in the column I go, the higher probability that that note will get played. So the C is pretty high here and the F pretty low here. Let's enter a few notes. Now these right 4 columns set various settings for this sequencer. This first one controls whether we play higher or lower octaves than our root note. So going down will increase the probability of lower octaves, and going up will increase the probability of higher octaves. The second setting controls whether we have a higher probability of shorter notes playing, and going down we increase the probability of longer notes playing from the base note length. And these last 2 settings control the randomness of pitch and rhythm. Now when I first tried using the sequencer, I was very underwhelmed, and let me show you why. We have these steps entered, and if I hit play now, you'll notice that it's extremely random and playing extremely fast. And if I were to adjust the octave ranges, it's now playing very randomly in different octaves. And you know, this may be what you want, but when I was trying to use this in a sort of musical way, it's, wasn't very appealing. And it took me a while to figure out how to adjust these settings appropriately to make it a bit more musical. Now the speed is easy enough to manage. If we hold down the YDiv button, we can now control the rate division, and so I can turn that down to 1/8. That's calm things down a little bit. The base note length now is 1/8 note, so we can go higher or lower from there. But we're still very random, which sounds okay, but I'd like a more melodic, more repeating sound. And to get to that was something that I hadn't fully grasped, which were the pitch and rhythm columns. you see when they're maxed out, it's completely random about what note gets played and whether or not a note gets played in particular rhythm. As we scale these settings down, the randomness gets more controlled and it's less likely to change until we reach the bottom. And at this point, the sequence is completely locked in. So if we just set a very small value here, this lets the sequence slowly evolve over time. And in this way, the sequencer is very similar to Turing Machine and Marbles in the Eurorack world. And it's also very close to being a hardware equivalent to Stepic in the DAW. We can also use the general random options to add another layer of probability around whether a note gets played or its octave, etc. So I can turn down the trig here, and now I have another layer of probability. So, what else can we do here? Well, you'll see this white playhead playing along here. And this has little relation to the notes that are underneath it. It's more acting as a representation of where we are in the sequence. So if we were to hold down the init or end buttons, we can adjust the length of the sequence or its starting point, which can make the looping a bit more noticeable. So I'm going to set it to 9 for now. So in another video, which I posted featuring the OXI, a question came up in the comments about setting parameter locks when using the sequencer and whether or not we can do anything about that easily. And while the OXI One can't set individual parameter locks in the same way that the Digitone sequencer can, what we can use are trigger locks in the Digitone sequencer itself, and kind of share the burden between both sequencers. That is, of course, assuming we have the Digitone sequencer following transport and playing at the same time, which right now we do. So going into record mode for our main lead sound, you'll see I have a few trigger locks set up, these yellow ones. I can create these by holding down the function key and just pressing a step. And now if I hold down a step, I can adjust a parameter, such as the filter settings here. And this will get affected whenever the sequencer reaches it when a note is playing, but it won't add any additional note data at the same time, which makes it differ from a standard step lock. These other settings are affecting the filter and portamento settings for this voice. Now you recall, I set the OXI to 9 steps at 1/8 note, and the Digitone is running at its default of 16 steps at 1/16 notes. So we have a little bit of phasing going on here, which will help with adding a little variation to this generative patch. We could also use the OXI's built-in LFO and modulation lanes to send MIDI and affect things both on the Digitone and on the OXI, but perhaps I'll leave that for a future video. I don't want to get too complicated for this one. So in the opening sequence, I was also using the Stochastic sequencer to play the pads and chords in the background. And to do that, I set up tracks 2 and 3 to both send to channel 2 on the Digitone. If we hold down Shift and press the track number, they're both set to channel 2. And that's because the Stochastic sequencer is inherently monophonic. So to be able to play in a polyphonic manner, we need to use multiple tracks to send to the same channel. The settings were otherwise very similar. Just enter some probabilities of notes. reduce the probability of changes for each one. Maybe add some additional octaves and set it up very similarly, but not necessarily the same on channel 3. This will allow us to add a little extra variation to the themes that get played. I also set the note length for these two channels to 1 bar, which I have set here already. So there we go. So if I were to mute channel 1 now and press play, we'll get the evolving pads coming through. And finally, for a quick look at Euclidean sequencing on the OXI, for the drums, we're using track 4 here, and we have that set into the multi-track mode, which lets us assign up to 8 MIDI channels for each row in this track. And this could apply to all 4 tracks, of course, and send out MIDI data to up to 32 different MIDI channels if we had that range available to us. So first we need to make sure that we have the kick and snare tracks assigned to the sequencer. So if I hold down the track number and press the sequence button, we have this first one assigned to channel 3. And then we can hold down track again and press the next one, and that's set to channel 4. So selecting the first lane again, we can hold down Shift and press the random button, and this gives us the Euclidean settings. And for this, we're going to set up a basic 4 on the floor, so we'll change the pulses to 4. And for the snare, we're going to select the next range again. And for that, I'm going to set this to a length of, a length of 14, and the pulses up to 5. And I don't want these first 2 at the same time, so I'm going to change the rotation to just nudge the snares over a little bit. And since this is playing only 14 steps, it will loop around, and we're going to be out of phase a little bit to the kicks. And we can listen to that on its own. And now we can introduce the rest of the track. And there you have it. The OXI One is a really very deep tool to have around for sequencing, and we've only scratched the surface here, covering just a couple of things that it can do. If you'd like to see more, leave a comment below. Otherwise, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.